All right, great. Thanks so much, Daniel. And thank you all for joining us. I know it's likely you've been on a webinar or two these past weeks, so we really appreciate you taking the time to join another one, the best one, of course, to learn more about enhancing stalking victim safety during COVID-19. My name is Dana Flightman. I'm the Associate Advisor of the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, and co-presenting with me is our Director, Jen Landheis, who can introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Landheis. I'm the director here at SPARC, and as Dana mentioned, just appreciate you all getting on the phone to us. Dana and I are going to co-present today. You are welcome to chat with us in the chat box, and one of us will be monitoring while the other one's talking, so that we can be sure to address any questions or comments that you have as we go forward. Thanks.
Yeah, and so we've been seeing articles about domestic violence during COVID, and Jen and I, we debated, do we want to do this webinar, because folks have been asking us, well, how is this impacting stalking victims? And the truth is there are things we know, and there's a lot that we don't know. We know that, of course, in normal times as well, stalking impacts different victims in different ways. And right now, states are doing different things, jurisdictions are doing different things, and so it's really hard to say and paint with a broad brush and say, well, here's what's happening with stalking victims. That being said, stalking, just to remind everybody, it's one of the 4 crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. We often get this attitude of this and stalking. We almost call their website andstalking.org. Though we didn't, it's stalkingawareness.org. I'll show it to you in just a second. And so when we're thinking about the pandemic and how it's impacting victims and survivors, we want to make sure that we're also thinking about stalking victims and survivors, whether their victimization is co-occurring with sexual or domestic violence, or if they are being only victimized by stalking. Of course, I don't say only to minimize that. And so all that being said, we appreciate you joining and looking at the pandemic through the lens of stalking and stalking victimization, and how it might be impacting those folks. And we also would love to hear from you, because it is such an unprecedented time. You're all working with victims and survivors every day, and so please do share in the chat if you've seen particularly stalking being impacted, if you have stories to share. That helps all of us learn, so we really appreciate that. SPARC is funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance and training provider on the crime of stalking. And our website is stalkingawareness.org. We have training modules. We're actually revamping one right now. So if you do any kind of public awareness education, resources for victims, we're not a direct service provider, but we do have safety planning guidance, documentation log, and other advice for victims. Practitioner guides, we break those down by the kind of practitioner. So we have for law enforcement, for victim advocates, for corrections. So definitely check those out. And webinars like this one. If at the end of this you're like, man, I wish I could hear Dana and Jennifer talk more, you are in luck, because our voices are all over the website. We have an archive of recorded webinars. We're also on social media. Our handle on there, we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sixth sense of humor at SPARC, if not, it'll be a long hour for you. So really your call either way. We also have a newsletter. We try to practice what we preach and not send too many emails. So we really just email when there's a new resource or something coming out, so definitely check that out. So why focus on stalking today? Well, stalking is a really critical thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It is a crime at the federal level in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories, on tribal lands, and in the Military Justice Code. It is a crime across the board. It might be a misdemeanor, it might be a felony, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation, but it is a crime. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is criminal, and so victims may be not reporting what's going on because they're saying, what, should I call the police because somebody rang my doorbell or drove by my home? And the answer is that they do have the right to report that and to document it and to seek help, because it is a crime. And it's traumatic. A lot of times when folks talk about how critical it is to understand stalking, they go right to the co-occurrence with physical violence and lethality. And that is important. I'll talk about it in just a couple seconds. But I want to also pause here and say that even if stalking does not co-occur with physical violence, it's a crime in its own right because it's a deeply traumatic experience. Many stalking victims experience mental health issues that can be lifelong. Quite a few lose time from work. So 1 in 8 lose time from work. More than half lose 5 days of work or more. And typically, stalking victims are not a protected class of worker. So in other words, if a stalking victim goes to their employer and says, hey, I'm having this issue, could I work a different shift? The employer could be wonderful and accommodating, or the employer could say, sounds annoying, you're fired. And so we see both of those situations play out. And quite a few relocate. So this really shocked me when I learned this. 1 in 7 stalking victims choose to move. And so think about that, or they feel they must move because of their victimization. Think about how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Still to pack up your things and get the movers and move your family. It's stressful, it's expensive, all those things. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims making that choice as a result of their victimization. So I think that just goes to show how consuming and traumatic this crime really is. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to actually harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicide, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. And yet so often these early signs are missed. As, oh, it's just texting, it's just following, nothing really violent happening here, it's just annoying. But actually, it's not just annoying, it's criminal, it's traumatic, and it's dangerous. The good news, though, is that stalking gives us an opportunity because it's one of the few crimes where early identification and intervention can prevent violence and trauma, violence, and possibly even death, right? And so we actually have that opportunity when we name stalking and intervene early to really, really help victims and survivors. So we're going to fix it. So today we're going to talk about, what is stalking? What are some of the dynamics and prevalence? We'll do that pretty briefly. We'll talk about stalking behaviors, which are quite varied, emphasizing how COVID-19 can exacerbate safety concerns. And then we'll think about practical strategies to protect victims, collect evidence, and hold offenders accountable. So what is stalking? So there's the behavioral definition and the statutory or legal definition. We're going to focus on the behavioral definition today. Behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So it's a pattern of behavior. It's not a single incident or a one-off event, and that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear Jen or myself kind of use those terms interchangeably, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. We're really talking about that same thing, that 2 or more incidents that make up that pattern. And stalking is directed at a specific person. That being said, we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe the stalker stalking, let's say, their ex-partner. That ex-partner starts dating somebody new. Okay, so now the stalker is reaching out to the victim and the victim's new significant other. So that's really common, and a stalker might also reach out to a victim's family, friends, coworkers, children, all of that. And so certainly a lot of folks can be involved and even considered co-victimized in a stalking case. But we'd still say it's directed at a specific person because the stalker is trying to get to that victim and they'll use other people to do it. But it's in the context and purpose of reaching that victim. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really critical to understanding stalking, and it's actually what separates stalking from a crime it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically something that would make a reasonable person feel angry, annoyed, disrespected, and harassment can be quite serious. So I'm not trying to minimize that in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. As with stalking, we're really talking about fear and a reasonable person feeling fear. But fear is tough, right? Because fear is quite personal. What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. And that's why context is so critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases because a lot of times what's scary to the victim may not seem scary to you as an outsider. For example, this was a case this woman called the police. She was hysterical, and all she would say was, "There's a cup of coffee in my car." So understandably, the police are not exactly sending out the SWAT team on this one, right? They're kind of like, you prefer tea? Like, what is your problem? Eventually, she calmed down enough and said, he's here. So it turned out the stalking victim who had relocated to avoid the abusive partner who was also stalking her, address confidentiality, the whole thing, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that morning. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't hear you or see you, but typically when I tell that story in person, people make a kind of like, sort of face. And what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear, right? It's really scary when we know the context, when we know the whole story. But until we know the story, we're just like, there's car coffee? Amazing, right? How do I get this car? And so we really need to ask those questions to understand that context. And so something might be frightening to the victim, but not to you. So we need to ask them, what message did that send to you? What's the story behind that? Tell me more about that. Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic example is an offender saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? The victim receives roses, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, this is so wonderful, what a sweet gesture, right? Because they don't know that context. And again, context is what makes stalking criminal in the first place, often, because many stalkers combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, like vandalism, for instance, with behaviors that, outside the context of the stalking case, would not be criminal, like texting or driving by a home. And so it's really that context that makes stalking scary, what makes stalking stalking, and what makes stalking criminal. So prevalence and behavior. Stalking is an extremely prevalent crime. In the United States, more than 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men experience stalking. And I want to say that this is the best available data, and it describes it in this very binary gender way. We know that people of all gender identities experience stalking. But if you look at this rate, and this is using a very conservative definition of stalking, where the folks answering the survey had to say they felt very fearful that they or someone close to them would be physically harmed, we're still seeing 1 in 6 women saying, yes, I've experienced that. So if you think about the rates of sexual violence on campus, for instance, it's about 1 in 5 women. Domestic violence, around 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women, depending what study you read. So even using this pretty high threshold for what is stalking, this pretty conservative definition, we're still seeing that the prevalence is right up there with those other crimes. And so certainly if we're seeing domestic violence escalating during this lockdown, et cetera, we know that stalking is happening and is likely increasing as well. Most victims know the offender. I'm sure this won't surprise all of you on the call because of the work that you do, but it is a misconception where when a lot of folks think about stalking, they think about celebrity stalking. They're thinking about, the Kardashians or Taylor Swift, and indeed, our stalking laws do come from a celebrity stalking case. It was Rebecca Schaeffer's murder in the 90s that led California to pass the first stalking law in the nation. But when we're talking about stalking and our victims and survivors, that's typically not what we're really talking about, right? And so overwhelmingly, they know the victim. About half the time, it's a current or former intimate partner. But I want to make the point that if about half the time it's a current or former intimate partner who's the stalker, it also means about half the time it's not, right? It can be an acquaintance, a family member, a person of authority like a supervisor or an academic advisor, and rarely, though sometimes, a stranger. And so I encourage you to think about, in your response to stalking, are you serving all victims of stalking? Because typically our stalking response is housed under our domestic violence response, and that's true on the victim services end as well as on the law enforcement end. And so, are you serving all victims of stalking even when they're not an intimate partner? If you aren't, do you know where to refer them? If you are, that's awesome. Do they know how to find you, right? Because if I'm being stalked by, say, a neighbor of my same gender identity, I wouldn't necessarily think to call something called like a family violence center, right? And so we have a checklist on our website of questions like that of, is the word stalking on your website, and do you share stalking stories and that kind of thing. But just something to think about when you're referring victims and serving victims. Are you serving all victims? And if not, do we know, who is and how to refer them? Because there's so many different relationships that can be stalking relationships. So stalking behavior is quite varied, and I do not mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers are extremely creative criminals. People always tell me when I travel and train that their most bizarre, disturbing stalking cases, or the most bizarre, disturbing cases are stalking cases. And so this is a framework from this wonderful researcher, T.K. Logan, called SLI, Surveillance, Life Invasion, Interference, Intimidation, that can help us think through the many varied stalking tactics that a stalker might utilize. And most offenders are using more than one tactic. They're not just showing up. They're not just following or whatever. They're doing a variety of things. And so I want to explain these categories a little bit and then ask you in the chat if you can let us know what you've seen, either during COVID or even more generally. We'd love to hear examples of what you've been experiencing in your work. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. It's how is the stalker tracking, monitoring, watching, gathering information on that victim. So if you could share in the chat a few examples of times that you've seen that, and if there are any that are especially escalating during COVID. I could think of some, but I'll give you a chance to type it in. I will say with surveillance that when a lot of people think about stalking, that's the first thing they think about is surveillance, and you kind of get that image of the binoculars. And surveillance is a part of many stalking cases, but it's not the only thing, and a lot of times these categories overlap and inform each other. So yeah, I see someone saying GPS tracker on a car. Absolutely. Classic surveillance, right? GPS, increasingly available, can be quite small. It could be on the car. It could be put in the person's purse or something like that. Finding the location on the phone, yeah, sometimes it's an external GPS device. Sometimes it's hacking into the phone and just watching the GPS and seeing where they are. Spyware, absolutely, also called stalkerware, on phones or computers. So watching everything that person texts, messages, what websites they visit, that kind of thing. Social media, somebody said, yeah, they could definitely just go on social media and see, well, who are they talking to and what's new with them and what places are they frequenting, and then show up there. So yeah, those are all great examples. So thanks so much, and please keep them coming. In addition to surveillance, we often see life invasion, which is how is the offender showing up in the victim's life where the victim does not want that offender to be there. And so the victim's trying to get through their normal day, and there's the stalker or signs of the stalker no matter what they do or where they go. So if you can share some examples of that. I already see a couple of them, that constant texting and calling, right? Victims trying to just, do their work day, and then it's the stalker again. There's another text, there's another call. They're trying to check their email, but they have to kind of wade through all this stuff on the stalker. Someone said unwanted gifts. Yeah, absolutely. So we have that, when is sending gifts scary? Well, it can be really invasive. And if you think about like the coffee cup example, it really sends a message to that victim that I know exactly where you are, right? So really invasive. Someone saying she's seen the defendant on the path by her house, she's known to use that path, and he lives 13 miles away. So basically, the offender's going out of his way to be in what's a public area, technically, right, near that victim. And so the victim wants to take her daily walk, and she knows that she might run into that offender. So yeah, that's a great example of life invasion, that this person's just there. We also see offenders just, in less pandemic-y times, joining something like, since when is this offender going to this church, or joining this a cappella group, or whatever it might be, but now they're just showing up all the time, whether in person or online. Someone said stalking by proxy. Yeah, so that's stalking by someone else. So maybe asking friends, family, coworker where they are. You can imagine how invasive and scary that can feel to a victim, where they, they're talking to their boss, and the boss says, oh, guess who I ran into, and they asked about you, and how scary that can be contextually. We're going to move on to, and of course these categories overlap, and that's fine. It's just to help us think more broadly about all the stalker behaviors. So interference, which is similar to life invasion, but it's what is the victim actually losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalker's behavior? What is actually changing in that stalking victim's life? And so if you could give me some examples of that. A couple we already talked about, that, the lack of loss of work, so they can't get to their job because maybe the offender slashed their tires. Okay, so now they can't, that's very interfering. Or maybe they can't work because that person hacked their email and ruined their reputation, right? So that's going to interfere with the victim's ability to not only get to work, but to find a job or to have a good reputation in that position. And any other examples you all can think of would be great. I think interference can be something very direct and obvious, again, like slashing tires. Okay, I can't drive to work because my tires are slashed. Or it can be that spreading rumors, constant messaging, slander. Yeah, we see a lot of spreading rumors, and you might be thinking, well, how can that be, is that really stalking? And it can be. For example, I read a case where the offender photoshopped images of the victim onto nude bodies, onto nude photographs, made a flyer, distributed it to everyone in that victim's building, and sent it to her workplace listserv. So that's not just, a rumor or slander. It's really interfering with that person's life, her reputation, possibly her safety if he included her contact information. And so we see that sabotage. And last but not least, intimidation. And of course, contextually, almost everything that you've all named can be intimidating, right? It's intimidating to have a gift from somebody that you don't want to be hearing from because it's sending you a message. If you have any other intimidation tactics you want to share, that'd be great. But that direct or indirect threats, and that's the thing with stalking. So often those threats are not direct. It really, again, takes that context. I also want to point out that often these tactics build on each other. So for example, if an offender is engaging in surveillance, so let's say they're keeping track of the victim and watching them, they know exactly where they are. And then they impersonate the victim on a dating website. And because they know where they are, they can say something like, hi, I'm in this red shirt and I'm sitting at this coffee bar, please come find me. So now we have a stranger approaching the victim, which could be really interfering, invasive, and intimidating because that surveillance is enhancing that, right? So these can all connect and build on each other. A few examples, and most of these you named already, but just to see, and of course, Jen, feel free to jump in if there's any that you're like, oh, we got to mention this one. That surveillance, following, watching, showing up, tracking, unwanted contact, property invasion. I do want to pause and just highlight really quickly. A really common stalker tactic is to break into a victim's vehicle or residence and not break or take anything, but just leave some sign they were there. So maybe they move a lamp or they leave the TV on a channel they used to watch with the victim. And so when the victim gets back home, they know that offender's been there, but unless they were themselves having some kind of monitoring, they feel they can't prove it. And so, but they know they were there, and they can't prove it. And that's something stalkers know. And that's why if a victim ever comes to you and says, I know it sounds crazy, but that should be a big red flag. Hey, this could be a stalking case, because offenders are intentionally trying to make it seem like nothing's happening, and they know how to toe that line and often cover their tracks, make it seem like nothing illegal or all that bad has happened here. Here's someone sharing a great example of that. I had a client whose stalker would send her Snapchat videos of him in their friends' houses, telling her all the ways he was going to hurt her in those rooms if she didn't get back together with him. And on Snapchat, if you're not familiar, it's a platform that erases a message after you see it. So if that victim was not strategically documenting that, okay, it's really intimidating and it's a direct threat, but how do we prove it? The Snapchat's gone, right? We have some strategies. We can talk to you about it, but that kind of thing, yeah. Interference, financial work sabotage, we already talked about a lot of these. Also, it's an attack not just on the victim, but on the victim's family, friends, pets, and intimidation. Again, all these can be intimidating, and we want to pay attention if there is a threat to, for all of this, but additionally, threats to harm oneself, threats to harm that victim, being specific about how that would hurt that person. Those are all intimidating tactics. And we'll talk more about some of these and how they might specifically come out in the COVID-19 situation in just a second. Like I said, most of the stalkers are using more than one means of approach. They're not just doing one thing, they're doing a variety. And when we're thinking about safety planning, which I know Jen will talk about in just a little bit, we want to think about that very much as a verb, right? We're safety planning, because it's not just, we tend to be kind of incident-based, and that's true for law enforcement, but it can be true on our victim services end as well. A victim comes in, they're really worried about, let's say, their car tire getting slashed, and so maybe we file a report on that, and we think about, well, here's a better place to park, and here's how to, set up a camera near that car. But when we're thinking about stalking behaviors, again, stalkers are extremely creative criminals, and most are engaging in more than one means of approach. And so we can't just focus on what's already happened. We need to be thinking broadly about all of these, that surveillance, life invasion, all of the strategies, and what might happen next. What else might go on? How can we safety plan around that? Sure, we don't know the future, but we can think about, well, here's all these different stalker strategies. And again, the stalker's only limitations, unfortunately, are their own creativity, and it's always the most bizarre things. Like I read a case where an offender drove 500 miles to carve his ex's name in trees near her home. That's a stalking case, right? And that's what they did outside of having all the bonus time with the pandemic. And so it's that kind of thing. And 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victims at least once per week. Many pursue daily. And the average duration of an intimate partner stalking case, so not the high end, the average is 2 years. I'm sorry, it's 2 years, and about 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And so stalkers have plenty of time to start with one strategy and then back off, and we think they're gone, but now they're trying something else. And so again, we need to think broadly about all the different stalker behaviors. Briefly, I want to highlight. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I wanted to highlight it's for those of you who have never had to do a webinar, it's impossible to read the chat and talk at the same time, which is why Dana and I divvy that up while we're talking. And I wanted to mention, many of you have put in the chat examples of things that in and of themselves can seem kind of benign if you don't understand the situation. Like someone had mentioned that the stalker kept coming over and mowing the victim's lawn, and that when she reported that to the police, their response was like, I usually have to pay somebody to mow my lawn, like you should be happy about it. So keeping in mind that as we build these cases, when you go back to look at some of the strategies that offenders are using and the tactics, like the fly tactics that we've mentioned, when we're looking at criminal cases, oftentimes we get caught up in what we can't prove, and especially if there's technology involved. I think we have a tendency to see that as a real barrier rather than seeing the opportunity that might be there for some of that technology to gather some of the evidence. So somebody had also put in the chat, oh, let's get the victim as many cameras as we possibly can get, because then maybe we can catch the offender. So considering using things like game cameras or deer cameras that might capture the offender coming onto the property or something like that. But also keeping in mind, as you look at these particular cases, there may be some incidents that we cannot prove. We have no idea who did it. We all know the offender did it. But as we move these cases forward, both through our criminal justice system, as well as looking at safety planning, we have to keep in mind that we might only be able to prove some particular incidents, but it doesn't mean we can't still continue to document the other ones that are happening and to include those in our report to law enforcement or in our safety planning, so that we are making sure that we're not only addressing, as Dana mentioned, what has happened, but what might happen, because we know offenders are so creative that the minute we cut off access in one way, they will often figure out another way to approach the victim. And I think one of the things that we really want to highlight in this particular webinar is understanding that COVID-19 has given room for stalkers who are really creative to begin with, perhaps more time, perhaps more access to be able to figure out how to torment the victim. And when victims are already feeling in this time, as many of us are, very anxious and worried about the day-to-day of their life and not knowing things, the uncertainty of everything that's going on, and you add to it the stress of not knowing where the offender is going to show up or what they might possibly do next, that can be really disconcerting for lots of victims. And we know that lots of victims' number one fear is not knowing what's going to happen next. And so if that's already a fear, plus we have all the uncertainty going on in the world right now, it only exacerbates the feelings that victims are feeling. And so I appreciate that many of you are saying that's why stalking logs are really important. And Dana just put up our link to the stalking log on our website. that we would consider you all keeping in mind and using with the victims that you're working with. It's available in English and Spanish. On one side of it is the log itself, and the other side has instructions for victims on how do we keep a log of this information. Understanding that we might not be able to prove that the offender is on the walking path that's next to the victim's house, but could we prove that he sent a text message later? So we don't need to be able to prove each individual tactic, but it's the overall event and the course of conduct that's happening and moving it forward either in our criminal justice system or in our safety planning. So I appreciate that all of you are really mentioning how difficult it can be in these particular cases to prove each and every incident. Some of you mentioned and asked about things showing up in technology and how do we gather some of that evidence. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But we also want to really mention, as Dana said before, how we're also looking at stalking as it coincides with intimate partner violence. And I've been doing domestic violence work for about 22 years, and I remember having a very big aha moment early on in my career when unfortunately I was involved in a fatality review. And we were looking at this particular case, and the victim had been experiencing things like text messages and the offender following her, and he was extremely controlling. This was all happening within the context of an intimate partner violence case, a domestic violence case. And because the victim was together with the offender, but eventually was not, we looked at all of the tactics that the offender was using. So things like monitoring her behavior and showing up at her work and intimidating her and looking at her social media. We looked at all of those things as just part of the coercive control that happens in domestic violence cases. It wasn't until we were doing the fatality review and we were mentioning all those particular behaviors that the offender was engaging in that there was the aha moment for me that he was also stalking her. And I think as a domestic violence movement, we have done a really great job of understanding coercive control as it happens within domestic violence. What we haven't done a really great job of is understanding that that coercive control is oftentimes stalking. And what we hear from a lot of people is it doesn't matter what we call it. Like, who cares if we call it stalking? It's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, we know that domestic violence offenders who are also engaging in stalking behaviors are our most dangerous offenders. And we know that oftentimes there is stalking preceding domestic violence homicides. But if we don't identify that it's stalking and we don't call it stalking, it never comes to our attention. But it's a red flag for cases that are going to end up in either severe harm or deaths for victims of intimate partner violence. But if we don't even call it stalking, how are we supposed to know that it's a red flag? And so keeping in mind as we look at these particular cases, you may be dealing with victims of domestic violence now who are suddenly seeing an increase in coercive controlling behaviors that are happening because of the pandemic that have never had those happen before, or because the offender has more time on their hands or the other situations that are happening in the world, they're seeing an increase in it right now. And I think it's really important that we continue to name those behaviors not only as part of the power and control and coercive abuse that happens in domestic violence cases, but also naming them as stalking. Because number one, it gives us a separate crime that we could charge if we have a victim who wants to outreach to the criminal justice system. But we also have the ability to safety plan around it. And I think that's extremely important because what we see happen during things like COVID-19 is that we see an increase in those coercive behaviors. And so some of the things that we need to think about are things like offenders exploiting victims' health concerns. So you may have stalking offenders who are suddenly keeping track of their victims for their own good. So playing it off to everyone that I just want to make sure that the victim is staying safe from the virus, that they're not going out, that they're not exposing themselves or their family to things, and so playing it off as a concern rather than as a controlling tactic. We also see that the pandemic a lot of times gives offenders excuses to contact the victim, to check on them. So as Stephanie said, yeah, new excuses essentially to say, I just want to check up on the kids, I want to make sure that you're not going out. I saw that you were at the gym. What are you doing back at the gym already? You know, are you trying to expose our family? Why are you putting my children at risk? And then also understanding that their interference might increase. So impersonating victims, damaging or stealing things like medical supplies. So we have a case of an offender who was approaching the victim's house and with the excuse that he was dropping off essential supplies. So things like masks and gloves and sanitizing equipment was his excuse for his reason for being near the victim's house. So he comes off looking at this out like this nice person who I'm just concerned about the safety of my children and my ex-partner, when in actuality it was an excuse to be able to access the victim's house. And as well as intimidation factors, so threatening to infect the victim or loved ones, or their presence might be more threatening due to health concerns. What we hear from victims, and I would love to hear from all of you as you are hearing things through the crisis work that you're doing, is we have victims who are suddenly at home and have not been at home, and so the increased fear because work was a safe place for them. They felt more supported there. They felt safer from the stalker being at work. Conversely, we see the opposite, where some folks have said, I'm an essential worker, and now the offender is using COVID as an excuse to show up at my essential place. So for example, there was a victim that we were contacted about who was working in a grocery store, and it was the only grocery store that was up and had good supplies at that particular moment in a pretty rural area. And so the offender was coming to the store more and more often with the excuse that they needed supplies. Quite possibly very legitimate, and manipulating the situation to their advantage. And so they had worked out before that the offender was only supposed to come when the victim wasn't working, but now the offender was showing up all the time saying, I need these supplies because I can't get them anywhere else. So understanding that these offenders are really creative and using whatever excuse might be out there right now to be able to essentially excuse away their behavior. So doing things like exploiting these health concerns. We also see some concerns depending on jurisdictions, and we would love to hear from all of you how it's being impacted in your jurisdiction. But what we're hearing from the field are things like there's been a decrease in offender arrests, more comments to domestic violence victims or to stalking victims about not getting as involved. We're going to tell people to take a walk around the block. We've kind of reverted in some jurisdictions to our old response, because we have a justice system and others that are intervening that perhaps aren't reacting in the same way that they typically would if the pandemic wasn't going on. And so we also see and are hearing from some victims that because stalking is a misdemeanor in their jurisdiction, that the offender isn't even being arrested or taken to jail. Or if they are, that they're immediately being released on a low bond or a cite and release, where before that might have been different, as well as some privacy concerns that might be coming up for individuals as they're accessing services online. And if you're not familiar with the National Network to End Domestic Violence Safety Net team, they've put out some really great resources about doing online services with victims right now, addressing some of the privacy concerns and technology concerns. I know many of you mentioned earlier on the chat that you see as one of the tactics that victims experience lots of contact on social media. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been on social media a lot more than I typically would be during the last few months, and I would surmise that victims are probably as well. And offenders know this, and so they're taking advantage of more increased contact on social media, perhaps using the guise of, oh, I'm just checking in on you to make sure everything is okay. Any concerns that any of you are all seeing in your jurisdictions, please let us know in the chat box so that we can talk about some of those. So we can have the heads up on what might be happening in your jurisdiction. And then we also have, because of COVID-19, potentially limited options. We have some victims feeling like they can't access safer locations. So their work might have been safer for them, gym might have been safer for them, mom's house might have been safer for them, and now they feel like they don't have those options. They also might have those limited contacts with those protective factors like jobs, an emotional support group, and there's fewer options for bystander intervention. So fewer options for people at work or people at the gym to notice the offender and to be able to assist in these types of cases. And lots of victims stating that they feel like their resource system is really overwhelmed and really not sure how to reach out for help. We know that all of you across the country are doing a really fantastic job of making sure that you're reaching out to victims and still providing access. And victims still already feel isolated and feel even more isolated right now during COVID. I think we also have to think about the differences that have been happening because our stalkers have some increased capacity. I noticed many of you on the webinar were calling in from college campuses, and so thank you for being on right now. I can give you an example of a college campus that contacted me last week for technical assistance, and they had been involved in this case prior to the pandemic and prior to their school closing, and there was a current campus stay-away order in place for the stalker offender to stay away from the victim. Now the victim had relocated home, which was in a different state than the university was in. The offender was continuing to contact the victim and in fact had crossed state lines to engage in some of this behavior, but this particular university was feeling a little overwhelmed about options for the victims because the stay away campus order, of course, was not enforceable as a civil order where the victim lived. It was a campus order. And so they had thought they had some safety measures in place, but hadn't thought about civil measures that might needed to be in place. They weren't as familiar with the resources where the victim's home state and home location was. They had done a really great job of networking with their local domestic violence and sexual assault programs and talking about all the options there. They hadn't thought ahead to what happens over summer break, what happens when we have a pandemic and we have to close down and now our victims relocated to a different state where we aren't as familiar with the resources. How will we talk to the victim about making reports about what's happening continually for the victim if the victim's not on campus, if they don't have access to their resident advisor or to somebody in the Title IX office like they had before? And so I think one of the opportunities that COVID-19 has given us is an opportunity to think about how are we making sure when we're safety planning with victims that our resources are going where victims go. Are we just covering where victims are at on college campuses? Are we also thinking about what happens if they have to go home? What happens if they're no longer on our campus? What are some of our options for continuing to deal with the offender's behavior? What does that look like for us? Because we know the stalkers, with their increased capacity, are having a lot less structure in their daily lives and fewer distractions. And so they might be engaging in some of these behaviors and becoming more controlling or more invasive in the victim's life. And we also know that for lots of victims of stalking, any change in the status quo equals a dangerous time for them. So if there's been a separation from the stalker, which has now happened because schools have shut down or because work has shut down, and so there's been a separation that has happened because the pandemic has forced it, or something has been happening and victims have had to enter a civil protection order, or if the offender has lost their job. Those are all increased risks of danger times for stalking victims that might now be exacerbated by COVID-19. And how are we dealing with those particular situations? And how are we working with victims to be able to gather some of that evidence or think about what support systems are out for them?
I just wanted to add really quickly too. There was an article from the UK about an increase in stalking reports during the pandemic, and I shared it in the chat if folks want to read it. But one thing that multiple victims were saying independently of each other was that they felt like sitting ducks. And I felt that was worth mentioning because it makes a lot of sense when you think about that increased risk to victims. They have fewer places to go. The offender knows where to find them, and they have fewer options. So exactly what Jen said, just in maybe a little bit more of a visceral form, I wanted to mention that feeling of, well, I'm just here and I know they can get to me, and what do I do and how do I plan around that? So I just wanted to voice that.
Thank you, Dana. I think this also gives us the opportunity, you know, we've heard over the years of doing this work, lots of people who inadvertently make victims feel more isolated by saying to them things like, well, why don't you just log off the social media? if they're contacting you via Snapchat, just get off Snapchat. Or if the offender keeps calling you all the time, why don't you just change your phone number? And really thinking about the impact of that. As we've talked about already, the fact that offenders are really inventive and that they just find other ways of accessing victims. When victims log off social media, when they stop answering their phone, it doesn't stop the stalking. The stalker doesn't give up. Instead, they just figure out another way to access the victim. And so what we see a lot of times is if a victim isn't answering the offender, if they're not texting back, if they're not logging some of that information, then the offender just kind of ups the ante and shows up in person. And then just like as Stephanie had just typed in the chat, it increases victims' feeling of isolation. All of us right now probably feel isolated. Many of us are turning to social media to feel more connected with individuals. And if suddenly your social media no longer feels safe to you, that can be very disconcerting for victims of stalking. But we also have to keep in mind that those same resources can also be a really great system of support. Victims might be contacting their friends, their family, getting on message boards for support, contacting their local domestic violence and sexual assault group through their Facebook page. So keeping in mind that just logging off isn't really an option. What we know right now and what we suspect is that victims are seeing an increase in contacts through social media while the pandemic is going on. We are working and very grateful to be part of a coalition against stalkerware. It's a worldwide organization that's working to address what some of you know as spyware, what we're learning to call stalkerware, where offenders are putting mobile apps on victims' devices, either their phones or their laptops, and monitoring everything that's going on. And so someone had mentioned earlier they had a victim who was seeing things show up in their cloud account, not really sure how that's happening. It could be that the offender has downloaded and put some type of stalkerware app on a victim's device. And we don't have really great statistics for the last 6 months to see about the increase that has happened from before COVID-19 was really here to now to see if that stalkerware and spyware is increasing. But what we do know is that just from 2019 to 2020, there's been over a 300% increase in the amount of apps that are being accessed and downloaded by individuals in attempt to monitor somebody else's behavior. So keeping that in mind as we move forward, I think one of the things that we all have to continue to think about is how do we help victims gather some of that evidence, knowing which apps like Snapchat will notify the offender if the victim takes a screenshot or tries to record it are really important. And so Dana has put up a lot of the great resources from our friends at NNED Safety Net team. If you haven't checked those out, please do so. We have lots of other resources for you as far as helping with technology, and we're always available for technical assistance if you have a specific app or a specific social media platform that you need help figuring out how do we gather evidence off of those to assist victims that we're working with. So please reach out to us, and we're happy to walk you through how to do all of that. We also have to think about that as we're working with victims, that victims' attempts to distance themselves from the stalker a lot of times leads to an increase in the physical threat to their lives. And so one of the things that we hear a lot of times from people who are working with stalking victims is, okay, it's fine and it's easy when the victim's not contacting the offender back, but the minute the victim's starting to have contact with the offender, now we don't have a stalking case because we can't prove that the victim was afraid of the offender. That's not true. What we know is that we have all done a really good job about being able to explain the dynamics in domestic violence cases when we have victims who are maintaining contact with the offenders because we understand that they do it out of fear. Same thing for stalking victims. We have lots of stalking victims who don't disconnect from social media, who don't disconnect from the offender, and may actually be having contact with the offender because it lets them know the offender's state of mind. It allows them to safety plan in a much easier manner if they know what the offender's thinking, how they're feeling, what they might be up to. And so please keep in mind, if you're working on stalking cases, many people want to see that clear line in the sand, victim told offender to stay away and now isn't having any contact. And then they get frustrated and overwhelmed when victims are having contact. And we know that many times victims are having contact because they're court ordered to, because they share custody, or because they're safety planning. So keep in mind as we move forward at being able to ask victims, what were you afraid of if you didn't call the offender back? What did you think was going to happen? Why did you call him that particular night? What information were you hoping to gather? Those things can help us get around that barrier that sometimes people think exists if victims are having contact. And it's just about being able to explain the dynamics in these particular cases. So when we're thinking about safety, not only during COVID-19, but always when we're working with victims of stalking, really trusting victims' instincts. And I think one of the things that we've done a really poor job of as a system when we work with victims of stalking is that victims of stalking become really hypervigilant. They are always looking over their shoulder, and they think everything that happens to them is associated with stalking because that's what's kept them alive. That has what's kept them safe. They're used to that particular hypervigilance. And as outsiders, we oftentimes look at some of the things that victims are engaging in or some of their behavior, and we have a tendency to label those victims as paranoid because we don't know what it's like to live with that type of hypervigilance. That hypervigilance has kept victims safe, and it's really important as a system that we learn to trust victims' instincts and that our safety plans have to continue to evolve. The longer stay-at-home orders stay in place, every time things change, so as many of our states are opening back up now and victims are trying to figure out, am I going back to work? Is it safer? Is it not safer? Where might the offender show up? Our safety plans have to evolve around those ever-changing circumstances and always considering what might the offender do next and anticipating what the offender's reaction is. So if, for instance, we have a victim whose place of employment is opening back up, she starts to go back to work, what's the employer's reaction going to be? As Dana mentioned earlier, a lot of times there are not protections for victims of stalking who are not in intimate partner relationships with their offender. And so telling their employer about what might be going on might not be a safety strategy because it may end up in the employer firing the victim. And then understanding how are we balancing safety and freedom for victims. Many of us during the last 3 months feel frustrated and upset about staying at home and feel like I can't go anywhere, I can't do anything. This is what victims of stalking feel like all the time. And not only are they worried about their health during a pandemic, but they're worried about another person manipulating this particular situation and harming them. So keep in mind that as we work on our safety plans, we have to consider some of these basic things and how do we balance victim safety with the freedom that they have. Because a lot of times victims of stalking feel like people tell them, well, just don't go anywhere and don't do anything and don't get on social media and don't go to that particular grocery store. That's not realistic. And so thinking about how do we balance those particular things for victims, as well as understanding how do we safety plan. And for some reason, that particular slide didn't show up. But I will tell you what it says. So one of the things that we need to keep thinking about with safety planning is really starting where the victim is. So start with where the victim's at and what they're hoping to see is going to happen. Asking victims, what have you already done is really important. I think it helps us establish credibility and also lets the victims know that we know by the time they're reaching out to all of us that they've already tried several strategies and it's not working. And the reason that they're reaching out to us is because it's not working, because the stalking's not stopping. So understanding that victims have already many times tried things and asking them, what have you already tried? What do you want to try? What do you need my help doing? And then trying to figure out how do we focus on victim strengths? What protective factors might be in place? What do they have already tried so far? What kind of emotional support do they have? And then being able to access those resources. We've all done a really great job about using our community response teams and our planned responses within our jurisdictions to really build a robust system of safety for victims of domestic violence. We're not completely there yet. We got a ways to go, but we need to apply those same strategies for victims of stalking and in our stalking cases. And planning for emotional safety. So how are we supporting victims not only during typical times, but also right now as well, when victims can feel really isolated and feel like, as Dana had mentioned, victims saying, like they're sitting ducks. Like, how do we plan for that emotional safety as well? And many times, making sure that victims feel like they have options. And somebody just asked me, how do you feel about victims who feel like they want to purchase a weapon? Oh, Olivia, that's a loaded question. What I would tell you is this. Every amount of research will tell you that when that happens, we are essentially bringing a weapon into a fight where there wasn't a weapon before. And so thinking about purchasing a weapon is not something that we would suggest victims do. Many times that weapon gets used on victims. Instead, thinking about what strategies would help the victim feel safer, because that's what's underlying their desire to purchase a weapon. So what can make you feel safer? What are some of those options out there? Who can we tell about what's going on? Do we need to relocate? What can make you feel emotionally safer are all options that we would want to explore prior to going to that particular step. So it would not be something that I would advise, and it could be a conversation that could be much longer than that, but please reach out to us if you have additional questions. But many victims what their desire is to feel empowered. And so thinking about how else can we support victims in feeling empowered in other ways. And so is that applying for a protection order? Is it going to a support group, that type of a thing? What we know oftentimes, and that leads me right into our next slide, is that victims want information. They want to feel prepared and they want to be able to predict. So they need information about the reporting process, about the criminal justice process, or the civil justice process. It helps them feel like they are regaining control. And many times that desire to purchase a weapon or something like that is about that empowerment and that need to feel in control again. And there's other ways that we can certainly explore that besides jumping to the point where they feel like they have to purchase a weapon. Dana mentioned earlier that one of the things that can be super helpful in these cases is a documentation log. This is an example of the one that's on our website. As we mentioned earlier, it's available in English and Spanish, and it helps assist in these particular cases. In that, what can happen many times is we have stalking incidences that are happening in several jurisdictions. And so when we are putting on the location of the incident and who may have witnessed it, and if the victim has contacted anybody, including campus security, a Title IX officer, then we are documenting everything that's going on. And this assists us in building these cases, either as we move forward through a civil justice system, through a criminal justice system, or through our campus response system, since many of you are on the phone are from campuses. As well as thinking about then what are some of our resources for all of you as professionals. For those of you that are not familiar with the tech safety resources by NMUGV, just go to techsafety.org/COVID-19. They've got some really amazing tools out there for providing services and considerations with working with survivors. We would also encourage you to check out NCJ-FCJ, that's the National Center for Juvenile and Family Court Judges, information on how to gather technology for evidence in court systems. Excellent resource. It can be really helpful in these particular cases. So for those of you that are like, oh, how do we gather some of this information? It's written directly for survivors to be able to use as their own self-litigants. So please think about downloading that particular resource. It can be extremely helpful. And we have on our website safety planning strategies about working on safety strategies with victims, as well as how to advocate for victims of stalking, all available on our website. As Dana mentioned it earlier, it's stalkingawareness.org. Sign up for our newsletters. We let you know when there's additional information coming out. And if this is the first webinar that you've attended by SPARC, we have numerous other ones that are recorded on our website under training, and it says training archives, and there's all of our recorded webinars that we've done with TA to TA that you can listen to and access. In the final closing, what I would say is, number one, thank you all for the amazing work that you do with survivors every single day. It's difficult during normal times. It can be even more difficult right now as the COVID-19 is increasing the isolation for victims. We want to continue to be a resource for you. Please reach out to us. Dana put our website there. These are our emails where you can reach out to us. We're on all social medias at Follow Us Legally. Let us help you in any way that we possibly can, but also please know that we appreciate you so much for the work that you are continuing to do despite everything that's going on. So thank you for helping keep survivors safe. Thank you for being that resource for them, and thank you for spending time with us today on this webinar. If you have additional questions, please email Dana or I or reach out in the chat box. But if not, we're going to let you go because we are unfortunately already at our hour time limit. So thank you all very much. The PowerPoint is right below the chat here. You can download the file. Please don't share the information on social media unless you check with us. But please share it with your colleagues and with the victims that you're working with. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.